Hi, welcome to week 9 for International Economics Echo 360. What we want to do today is really continue the discussion that we started last week about tariffs. Before we go ahead and construct the formal graphical models, I want to take this opportunity one more time to make sure that the idea that we spoke about last time, outside of obviously the descriptive matters, the distinction between a nominal tariff that is applied and the actual rate of protection. One of the best examples, I don't want to go ahead right now and give you another numerical example. We gave you a numerical example last time. You have one in the book, so I'm not going to bore you with all of these details, but just in case the idea was not very clear, let me go ahead and make sure that we can stress it one more time, at least the theory behind it. In the early days of the laptop computers, I don't know if, to be frank, I haven't really looked up the technology to make sure, to find out whether it has changed much from then. But most of the screens for the laptop computers were manufactured in Japan. All of them, actually. I think something like 90% of them in the world, maybe even more, were manufactured in Kobe, Japan. The Pentagon in the United States obviously has an interest in trying to make sure that it has a very reliable chain of supply. And so it uses some of these screens for very many of its different arms and airplanes and laptops and what have you. And so it had a very small, literally speaking, tiny manufacturer in the United States that supplies it with that particular flat top screen. So the Pentagon had an interest in trying to protect that particular manufacturer, and it goes without saying, what did they do? They just used their influence and convinced certain members of the Congress to go ahead and impose a high tariff. Let's say, for the sake of the argument, 50% ad valorem. So if the value of the screen is $200, then you impose a tariff of $100. I mean, on the surface, it sounds just fine, isn't it? We're going to be protecting this American manufacturer. However, as you might have already concluded, I hope most of you, if not all of you, very many of the other businesses in the United States did not like this. And maybe even the consumers, by the way, didn't like this. But however, the people who organized and lobbied and defeated this effort by the Pentagon were, as you might imagine, the IBMs, the Dells, and the HPs of the world. Because at the time, they were the major manufacturers of laptop computers in the United States, and their competition obviously was Hitachi and probably a couple of Japanese, South Korean manufacturers. And so they said, wait a minute, if you're going to go ahead and increase the price of a screen through a tariff by, for example, $100, then all of a sudden we will no longer be competitive, and so we will lose the millions of units that we sell every year in the United States and maybe even all over the world. So in this particular case, the tariff was intended to offer protection to a certain manufacturer, and it did. But it wasn't very well thought out because nobody stopped to think about the implication of that on certain other manufacturers that are going to use that screen as an input into their own final product. So that really, in essence, that additional $100 made, in essence, ate away most of the profits or most of the value added for the IBMs and the Dells and the HPs of the world. And one more time, this is exactly why this issue is crucially important. So that whenever we want to talk about a tariff, we just don't talk only about the fact that there is a tariff to protect, let's assume, garment the garment industry in New York City. Because the garment industry in New York City, since most of the textiles are imported, most of its protection will go away if we go ahead and offer protection also for the textile industry. I.e., if you go ahead and you offer a shirt manufacturer, say, $5 worth of protection, but you go ahead and increase the tariff on the imported material by $5, then you really haven't done anything. Or if you go ahead and increase even the protection of the textile industry, since it might be more powerful, by, for example, $20, then the American manufacturer has not gained anything. Actually, you might be even penalizing the American manufacturer of finished products in that particular case. So whenever we talk or whenever we want to evaluate the ultimate effect of a tariff, it is important then to take into consideration not only the effect of that particular tariff on one manufacturer at one level, but to find out what is going to be the effect of the whole tariff structure on the industry or on the imports of that particular country. Having said this, let me right now, again, in an effort to just remind you of something that's going to be very important before we get into a discussion of the actual models, that all of these models, and maybe 2 or 3 more to come, depend very strongly on that idea of consumer surplus and producer surplus that we have discussed before. We've discussed it a couple of times actually, but one more time as a quick reminder without any actual example, since some of you might not have taken your micro recently. What you're really talking about is just very simply the idea of a supply curve and a demand curve. Let's look at the demand curve, since normally we emphasize a little bit more, at least, the idea of the consumer surplus. All what we're saying is that if the first unit is going to be, somebody is going to be willing to pay $10 for the first unit, and somebody will pay, let's assume, $9 for the second and $8 for the third, and what have you. But the equilibrium price in the market is 5. So what are we really in effect saying? We're saying in that particular case that that first individual, she would have been willing to pay $10, but actually she wound up in paying only something like $5. So in that case, what is it that has happened? She has really gotten a surplus between what, let's say, the difference between what she would have been willing to pay and what she actually paid. It is an area, it is a benefit that she has gotten for free. The second person would have gotten a smaller surplus because the second person would have been willing to pay 9, but they paid 5. The third person would have been willing to pay 8, but they paid 5, and so on and so forth. So if you add up totally all of these surpluses, they really represent a triangle. And what triangle? It is the area between the price level and between the demand curve. So it's the area under the demand curve and above the price. In that particular case, really, you're saying that you can measure it precisely. Because what are you assuming then? You're assuming infinite divisibilities. That is to say, you can buy 1/1,000,000th of a book or 1/1,000,000,000th of a shirt, or whatever the case might be. Now, the same idea is also true, by the way, when it comes to the issue of the producers. The producers are, in essence, willing to supply a particular quantity, let's assume the first unit, at $5. If they're willing to supply the first unit at $5, and the second unit at 6, and the third unit at 7, but the market price is 10, what does that mean? That means that the unit that they would have been willing to supply at 6, they're charging for it 10. So they're making a surplus of 4. The second unit will be a surplus of 3, the third unit a surplus of 2, and so on. So the total producer surplus will be the area that is above the supply curve but below the price level. And the important thing about this level of equilibrium is that this is the best point that maximizes, this is the only point that maximizes both producer surplus and consumer surplus. So this idea is going to be used over and over again, and in particular right now for talking about trade, because we really use that in order to measure the level of welfare. Why is this the measure of welfare? Because in essence, what does it mean when you're willing to pay $10 for an item, or $9, or whatever the case might be? It means that is the benefit. That's the way that you quantify the benefit. So if we are to quantify welfare using money, then we're saying really the benefit is the difference between what you would have been willing to pay and what you actually pay. And for the producer, it will be the difference between what the producer is actually paid and what the producer would have been willing to accept for that particular good or commodity. Keeping that in mind then, let's see right now if we can do a very simple illustration of the benefits or of the of trade. The best thing to start is to look at a situation whereby there is no trade. So look at a commodity. Let's assume this commodity, whatever it is, I know, shoes, textbooks, shirts, whatever. So this is the demand, and this is the supply for that particular commodity in this particular country, and there is no trade. If there is no trade, then this country is going to have this quantity supplied at that particular price. This will be the producer surplus, and this is the consumer surplus, right? Now, we're going to open this country for trade, but we're going to make an assumption, by the way, is that this country is small, or relatively small. That's to say, it cannot affect the world price. So the world price is P sub W. The fact that the country right now is going to start importing isn't going to affect the world price, so the world price stays at P sub W. What has changed for this country? Well, what's obvious is that right now, the domestic suppliers are no longer going to supply this quantity, but they're going to supply a lower quantity. Why? Because the price has dropped, say from 15 to 10. What happened right now to the consumers? Well, the consumers are going to be willing right now to consume a larger quantity. So instead of consuming this quantity, right now their quantity demanded is going to increase. So if the suppliers are going to supply, say for the sake of the argument, 100, and the demanders are demanding 150, where are we going to get that 50? Well, that 50 therefore is imported. So the difference over here between the supply and demand, this represents the quantity that's imported. Now, what's been the effect of this on the overall level of welfare of this particular society? This is, by the way, maybe the best example to show the benefit from trade. It goes without saying, in this particular case, that the domestic producers are losers. Because remember, they used to produce 1 million cars, right now they're going to be producing only 200,000 cars. So they've lost quite a lot of production. By losing all of that production, what happened? They lost quite a lot of their producer surplus. So their producer surplus used to be this big triangle. Right now it has become this smaller triangle, right? So they have lost this area. This area is lost right now by the producers. But what about the consumers? Well, the consumers used to get this upper triangle as their consumer surplus before trade. After trade, it has become this bigger triangle. So what's happened to the consumers? Well, the consumers have gained all of this area, right? This trapezoid. The triangle plus this. But this has been lost by the producers, it has been gained by the consumers, lost by the producer. So what's the net effect on society in this case? The net effect is that all of this triangle has been gained. So as a result of trade, in this particular case, this society has gained this much. Its level of welfare has improved. Now, one would wish that this was the case in the real world. It really isn't the case in the real world for a very simple reason, as we all know, is that these domestic producers that have lost are going to go ahead and lobby the authorities to go ahead and offer them some protection. And the authorities probably will go ahead and offer them some protection. How do we offer them protection? By imposing a tariff. So we impose a tariff over here. Let's assume, just for the sake of the argument, that this price was 15, the domestic price. The world price is, say, 7, and the domestic authorities right now impose a tariff of 2. So this becomes 9. What's happened right now to the producers? The producers have regained some of what they have lost. There was no trade. There's completely free trade they lose. Right now they regain part of what they have lost through the imposition of a tariff. But what about the consumers? Well, the consumers right now again are going to give back part of what they have gained. So the consumers used to get all of this area in the bigger triangle. Right now they're going to be getting only this area. So what have they lost? The consumers have lost, therefore, this area that I'm labeling 1, 2, 3, and 4. So all of this is an area that's been lost by the consumers as a result of the imposition of the tariff. But what happened to 1? 1, as we have already said, is what has been regained by the producers. So 1 is gained by the producers, but it was lost by the consumer. So right now it's going to stay within that particular society. Let's not worry about the effect of its income distribution for the time being. So if that's the case, there is still a loss of 2, 3, and 4. However, not all of this is a loss. Because remember, what did we say? That these are going to become the imports, but these imports right now are subject to a tariff, a $2 tariff per unit. So every single one of these, say, 1,000 units is going to be taxed, there's going to be a customs duty of $2, so that will be $2,000. So the area 3 is the revenue from the tariff. And who gets the revenue from the tariff? Is going to be government. So in this particular case then, the consumer loses 1, 2, 3, 4. The producer gains 1, but 3 goes to the government in tariff, and we assume obviously that the government is very enlightened, so it's going to take that money and spend it for the benefit of everybody in society. So society, therefore, the net result is that it has lost 2 and 4. And what we're really simply suggesting is the fact that always and forever, if we're talking about a small country, and for all practical purposes we'll assume that most of these models are for, relatively speaking, small countries, i.e. countries that cannot afford, that cannot affect the world price. So in that particular case, always and forever there is a loss, and the words right now become very important. It's a dead weight loss. What is the dead weight loss of a tariff? It's the total area of these 2 triangles, 2 plus 4. And by the way, knowing, obviously, if you knew the exact value of each of these, coordinates over here, then you'll be able to calculate to the penny the potential loss in welfare due to a tariff. Let me give you a very simple example, since we're talking about straight lines. Let's say, for the sake of the argument, that the tariff is 2. And let's assume that this over here represents 50, and this represents 150. So how much is the area of 2? Well, by now, I'm sure you all figured it out. The area is going to be what? The base times the height over 2. So it's going to be the 100 times 2 over 2, which is 100. Then you can do the same thing for this. Let's assume that this is only 50. So it's going to be 50 times 2 over 2, which will be 50. Therefore, the total welfare loss in this particular case might have been 150 billion, 150 million, or whatever units you are going to be utilizing. So we can really potentially calculate what will be the welfare loss whenever a tariff is going to be applied. Now, remember what we have just said earlier by stressing the fact that this example is true, always and forever, and in particular whenever there is a small country. For the world as a whole, the world, there are absolutely no qualification. The world always loses whenever there's a tariff. In this case, even the country that is imposing the tariff is going to be losing, because 2 and 4 have evaporated. These areas of welfare did not go to anybody else. So let's stress this one more time for those that again have not kept with us. 1 is lost by the consumer but is gained by the producer. 3 is lost by the consumers, is gained by the producers. 2 and 4 is lost by the consumers, is not gained by anyone. So it's just, literally speaking, an evaporation. Nobody gets it. And that's why it's an absolute total net loss in the level of welfare. And what caused it? It's the imposition of a tariff. So ideally, as you can see, you don't want to have any tariff, because then you wouldn't have this welfare loss. But what's the exception that we sort of implied? Why are we insisting that this be a small country? For the simple matter that sometimes if you are a large country, at least in economic terms, as far as that particular commodity is concerned, then that implies that you might have the power to go ahead and influence the world price. The United States, being the largest economy in the world and being again very wealthy, is, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your frame of reference in this particular case, let's say if it wishes to, it can probably act in many cases as to influence the world price of commodities. But the important thing that I should add immediately is that I know of no case, and I have tried to do research on this more than once, and I've never found anything convincing that the United States has ever used this particular tool. So the US does not use this tool of trying to impose what is known as an optimal tariff. So what's an optimal tariff? An optimal tariff is a tariff that is imposed by a country that is large, that can therefore influence the world price. So by imposing that particular tariff, it can force the exporter to absorb part of that tariff. Under some circumstances, the extreme is that you can really even influence the exporter to make them absorb all of that particular tariff. So what's the direct implication of this? And we'll look at the model in a minute. The direct implication is that some of these countries that are large enough, that are in that position, can impose a tariff without hurting themselves. The world will always be a loser, but that particular country that is imposing the optimal tariff can calculate it in such a way as to even gain from the imposition of that particular tariff. Now, what's the logic behind it before we look at the graphical representation? The logic behind it is really very simple. If the rest of the world depends quite a lot on the market of, let's assume, the United States, you have, I think a very good example, by the way, might be, for example, the Jaguars. To a smaller extent, maybe even the Porsches, but in particular the Jags. The US used to represent over 60 or 65% of the market for the Jaguars. Now the Jaguar is part of an Indian company. Things might have changed a little bit, but let's assume, for the sake of the argument, as an illustration, that the United States still represents 80% of the market of Jags. If the United States is going to go ahead and impose a tariff, say, for the sake of the argument, of $20,000 a unit, in that particular case, Jaguar would become totally uncompetitive, will not be able to compete, let's assume, with the Lexuses of the world, or with the potentially some of the Cadillacs of the world, and what have you. So what would they have to do? Well, they cannot afford not to export to the United States, because the United States is their bread and butter. Actually, it's 80%, let's assume, of their market. So in that case, they will be forced then to eat most of that particular tariff. I can see some circumstances whereby they will be forced to eat in the whole tariff. But let's assume, for the sake of the argument, they decide to just absorb only half of that tariff. In that case, the price would increase only by 10,000, and so on and so forth. So in that particular case, the United States would have imposed a tariff of 20,000. The price of that product would increase only by 10,000, which means that the exporting country, the Jaguar company in this particular case, will be really footing the bill for the additional sum of money. How can we show this graphically? Now, it's very important, and you've got to be able, again, to reproduce this. It really is very similar to this, with a minor deviation. Let's assume that the world price is this, P sub W. And you're going to impose this tariff of $4 a unit. Let's assume, just to make it simple, since that's the way that I constructed it, that more or less half of the tariff is going to be eaten up by the company. That's to say, the world price will increase not by 4 in this case, but will increase only by 2. Now, why is the price increasing? Only because you're a large country over here. Once you imposed a tariff, it just went all the way. In this case, you're forcing the rest of the world to eat part of the tariff. And so, if this price was, say, 8, you impose a tariff of 4, this increases only by 2. So the price right now is in the marketplace is going to become 10. The other 2, it's here. I mean, this is 4, but only 2 is above the world price and 2 is below the world price. So what's happened right now to this particular market? Notice, this used to be the area of the consumer surplus, right? Just like this one. Right now, this has become the area of the consumer surplus. So what's happened? The consumers have lost 1, 2, 3, and 4, right? One more time, the domestic producers used to produce this. Right now, they're producing more, so the domestic producers have right now gained 1. But right now, this is the issue of the tariff. What is the government going to gain? The government is not going to gain only 3, because remember, the government has imposed a tariff of 4, and the price has gone up only by 2. Why? Because this company, Jaguar in this particular case, has decided to foot the bill for the other 2. So the total bill for the tariff is both 3 and 5. That's to say, it will be this area of the tariff times the number of the number of the units. So the government in this case would have collected 3 and 5. So let's go ahead and net them right now. If we net them, what do we find out? We find out that 5 is positive, that is the net by the government, and 2 and 4 are the losses by the consumers. So what is it that we're saying? We're saying that 5 could potentially offset the sum of 2 and 4. So 2 and 4 are the losses by the consumers, but the gains by the government, by the tariff, that's going to be respent, by the way, by the government in society, could be greater than the losses that have accrued to the consumer. So and there is a way, by the way, because you know what are the elasticity, you know how much you're going to be able to force the other countries to absorb part of that particular tariff, and you can set that tariff to become optimal so that it will cover as much as possible of these losses, and potentially in some cases you'll be able to more than offset these and to actually wind up with gains. So a large country has the power to make tariffs work for its benefit, but for the world as a whole it will always be a loser. Okay? Now, we need to do a couple of more things. Let me right now just again go through them very quickly. The other form, very popular form, of interfering with the flow of trade, besides tariff, is to go ahead and impose quotas. Quotas, again, are really very simple. Because all what you're saying is that, let's assume in this case, that at the world price, you used to import, say, 200 units, and the domestic producers right now want some protection. So instead of a tariff, what they could do is that they could lobby to make you go ahead and say, impose a quota, say that we will never import more than 100. So you import only 100 instead of the 200, and everything else becomes the same. Actually, the quota could be calculated in such a way as to form exactly the same net result as a tariff. Notice in this particular case, right? The quota over here could be exactly this. There can be absolutely no difference between them. So there is a tremendous similarity between a quota and the tariff, except for one thing that we're going to add immediately. Obviously, the 1, 2, 3, and 4 are going to be the loss of the consumer surplus. The 1 is going to be the benefit of the domestic producers. The 2 and 4 is going to be the loss, the net loss of the consumers. But what about 3? 3 in this case, under tariff, was revenue by the government. Who gets the 3 over here? Well, it depends on the country. A government, once they issue a quota, could go ahead and sell the right for a quota. And so they could raise really all of this. In the United States, unfortunately, we don't sell the price very often, so we don't realize this. So all of this really goes to whom? It goes to the importers. Now, if the importer is a monopoly, then all of this really goes to the importer. If it is a 5 or 6 or 7 different importers, then they're going to get them. So this is going to affect also the distribution of income in society, because it's really going from the consumers to either 1 or 2 or 3 producers. An excellent example of this, by the way, in the United States, which is very unfortunate, is sugar. The United States, still up until now, imposes a great big quota on sugar, and that's why the price of sugar in the US is much higher than the price of world sugar. And all of this is only historically as a result of one or two families that have managed to buy enough influence in the Senate to keep on renewing this particular quota, which has, by the way, very many negative effects. Quite a number of our major candy manufacturers have threatened to stop producing candy in the United States unless we do something about reducing this quota so that they will become more competitive. Because at one time, I'm not suggesting that these are the exact figures because I haven't double checked them. Let's assume that the world sugar could be selling for 7 cents a pound, while in the United States it could be as high as maybe 15 or possibly even 18 cents a pound, and so on and so forth. Now, this in particular, I'm using it not only because of the quota. As a result of the quota, I mean, it's fine. As you can see, it really is very similar to the tariff with that potential. But there is something that is relatively new and that is used by the United States probably more than most other countries. It initiated in the United States, if I'm not mistaken, and I don't believe it's mentioned in the book. Maybe it is, but the diagram I don't think is in the book, is known as VER, the Voluntary Export Restraint. You know, we haven't spoken about the WTO. We might later on spend a couple of minutes talking about it, but if you still recall, historically, when we speak about this idea of free trade, we're really essentially saying that the WTO was that organization to try and impose all of these regulations on all its members. So we would like to, when we say that as a result of the Tokyo round or Kennedy round or Doha round or whatever it is, the level of tariffs dropped, it means that it's got to be applied to everybody who is a member of the WTO. So you're not allowed to go ahead and discriminate. And sometimes you're not allowed to go ahead and increase the level of protection beyond a particular point. So what happened in the United States, all of you are too young to remember that, but probably if you ask any of your, older neighbors or maybe parents, you'll find out that at one point in the 80s, in the late 70s, early 80s, American car manufacturers were having a great big difficulty in holding onto their market share as a result of the Japanese cars. Right now you look at the Japanese car and they're all over the place, but at that time it was still a relatively new phenomena. Japanese cars really started capturing large shares of the American market only as of the latter 60s, early 70s. So by the late 70s, American companies were really starting to hurt. So to make a long story short, what did we want to do therefore? Well, the American car companies started lobbying the White House to find out what is it that can be done. Well, the United States could obviously go ahead and impose tariffs, certain punitive tariffs for that matter. But that would have been a violation of all of these international agreements. So the US came up with a very interesting kind of a solution, and they sent President Bush Sr., who was then the vice president for Ronald Reagan. So Bush Sr. goes to Japan and negotiates with the Japanese, and in essence, at least these are the stories that are told, not that I'm privy to the exact negotiation that went on, that President Bush went really with a message saying, look, if you don't do anything about restricting your exports of cars to the United States, this might force the Congress, that is under tremendous political pressure from the unions and from the families of the laborers in the car industry, to go ahead and impose a restrictive tariff. So for the benefit of all of us, because we don't want to break our international agreements, it would be much better if you will go ahead and place restrictions on the Japanese companies to the number of units that they can export to the United States. And ultimately they did work out a schedule which says something to the effect that during the first year of that agreement they will export to the United States only 1.2 million cars. During the second year that will go up to 1.3 million cars, and ultimately to 1.5 million cars, and so on. So what's the effect of this? The effect of this really is nothing else but a quota, isn't it? But what is it that makes it different? It really is a huge difference. I am one of the people that believes that the United States, by doing this, thinking that they were really protecting Detroit, have actually shot ourselves in the foot. Because notice what happened. By imposing that particular quota, whether it's 1.5 million or 2 million cars or whatever the case might be, who is it that was getting this free right now? As I hope you have already guessed, all of this free right now this area was going to the Japanese manufacturers. Because as soon as this quota was imposed, then the price of a car, instead of being, say, for the sake of argument, $3,000, it becomes $4,000. So the Japanese manufacturers become much more profitable. And if the Japanese have to limit their export to the United States, say, for example, only to 1.5 million, are they going to export the stripped down Corolla, or are they going to try and export the very fancy large cars? Well, obviously, you've guessed it. They might as well export the car that has all sorts of gadgets on it and that is more expensive. But they didn't have expensive cars at the time. So what did they do? That was the time when they created the Lexus, the Acura, and the Infiniti. So they really used the profits that were gained from the United States to produce all of these fancy cars with all of these gizmos on them, and definitely the rest is history. Right now, most of the American car manufacturers, there aren't really that many of them in the luxury field any longer. Lincoln sells only, I think, close to 100,000 units a year only. Cadillac sells only 150,000 units a year, while BMW, Mercedes, Lexus, Acura, all of them outsell them. And so in essence, we really wound up, is what I'm saying in this particular case, financing the growth of the Japanese car industry, and we're the ones who, in essence, provided them with the incentive to start producing these large, fancy cars. And that was also the time when cars, you used to be able to go ahead and you start with a stripped car and you add all sorts of options. Right now, if you've noticed, most of the cars come with all sorts of options already included. And that was only, again, as a result of this. If you're going to be limited only to a certain number of cars, you might as well sell them with as many options as you can in order to improve your profitability. And we've used this, by the way, in a number of other areas, not only in cars. But all what I'm saying is that once you use this particular idea of VERs, in essence, you are exporting this profit to the country that is doing the production. And so 1, 2, 3, 4 is going to be lost by the consumers, 1 is going to be gained by the producers, 2 and 4 is going to be the net loss, plus 3. So 2, 3, and 4, in essence, in this particular case, become the net loss of that particular country as a result of I would really call it personally a policy that was not well thought out. For the time being, initially it looked as if it was really benefiting Detroit, but it did not wind up in benefiting Detroit quite a lot because of we didn't place any restrictions on what will happen to these 3. The other thing, by the way, and there was probably a positive effect of this, is that the Japanese right now, we really don't have to place any restriction because most of the Japanese cars are produced in the United States. That's not the only reason, but one of the reasons why so many of these imported of these Japanese cars, and right now even BMWs and Mercedes and VWs are produced in the United States. So the transplants, that was another incentive, because then a transplant is not considered to be an imported car any longer. So Honda, for example, let's assume Honda's share was, say, 200,000 units, but Honda has a market for 300,000 units. So they might as well produce 100,000 units in the United States, and then they wouldn't be subjected to all of these things. So we really encouraged the creation of the transplants in the US in this particular case. There is only one other thing that I want to add, because sometimes students find this to be a little bit difficult, by the way. For one reason or another, and it isn't, but I've decided, just in case somebody does, to go ahead and show the diagram. You know, we've been talking all the time about tariffs on imports. There are certain countries, the US is not one of them. Constitutionally, we are not allowed in the United States to place a tariff on exports. But there are certain countries that place a tariff on exports. If you're going to place a tariff on export, the net result really is almost the same. This would have been the world price. You place a tariff, and so therefore the price is going to drop. And so the consumers in this particular case are going to gain 1. The producers are going to lose 1, 2, 3, and 4. The government is going to gain 3, and so the net loss is going to be 2 and 4. So one more time, it's really very similar, but instead of it being an import right now, it's an export. And one more time, what do we assume? We assume that it's going to be a small country, so once you go ahead and you impose a tariff, you're not going to affect the world price. The only other thing that I want to add, and I put the word over here so that I wouldn't forget it, is that one of the problems, by the way, of tariffs is that they could lead to retaliation, especially, I mean, the optimum tariffs. If a country goes ahead and applies an optimum tariff as to affect the world price, then it is going to probably lead to certain retaliation. And as they keep on starting that particular trade war, the effects are detrimental for everyone. And so with this, I'm going to leave you, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.